Lin Feng glanced at Raymond, Long Wu, and Yu Jing. A gradual smile appeared on his lips. Then, I'll gladly accept it. Hearing that Lin Feng had agreed, Raymond heaved a sigh of relief. This meant that Lin Feng approved of his division. Lin Feng naturally had his own considerations. It might seem like obtaining the new substance this time was only his work. Even if he devoured it all, it would not be a big deal. Raymond and the others would definitely tolerate it, despite any discontent. At most, they would part ways. But in reality, if not for Raymond's previous plan of continuing to venture deeper, would Lin Feng have kept venturing deeper? If not for Raymond's plan, would he know how to use laws for detection? This was experience. This was Raymond's plan. Long Wu was also adequately powerful. Yu Jing might be a little weaker, but she likely had her own strengths too. It was just that she had not used them fully. Each of them had their own unique role. Lin Feng's cooperation with Raymond and the others could work together would allow them to obtain more new substances, so why not? If he insisted on acting alone, the gains would not be worth the losses. Hence, so what if he shared 10% of the new substance? It was worth it. Moreover, Raymond and the others knew their boundaries. Lin Feng did not need to expend too much effort to work with such people. All right, we'll divide it like this. Raymond personally divided this new substance into 2 parts, and Lin Feng took 90% of it. Although Lin Feng took 90% of it, this new substance was very massive. Even if it was only 10%, it still looked like a lot. The 3 of them divided it equally between them, and everyone was happy. There's no time to lose. The second and third waves of the Big Bang are coming next. Therefore, to deal with any problems that arise at any time, the stronger we are, the better. Everyone, stay here and use the new substance as soon as possible to increase the strength of your combat body. That's right. Your Highness Lin Feng used the new substance first. We'll guard your Highness Lin Feng. As a quasi-emperor, Lin Feng was the strongest person in the team. Hence, Lin Feng's safety was very important. With Long Wu and the others guarding Lin Feng could also use the new substance at ease. Thank you for your trouble, your highnesses. Lin Feng did not stand on ceremony. He was indeed eager to improve his combat body. Hence, he immediately held the new substance in his palm. Smelling the strange fragrance of the new substance, Lin Feng's heart was very calm. Fuse! With a thought from Lin Feng, a great many cells began to envelop this new substance. Even though 90% of the new substance was like a huge mountain, it was still so insignificant in Lin Feng's palm. After many cells had enveloped the new substance, it was as if a huge bump had grown in Lin Feng's palm. Boom! When Lin Feng fused all the new substances into his body, his combat body felt as if it was about to explode. A terrifying energy nourished every cell in his body. Divide! Actually, Lin Feng did not need to actively control it. The cells to still divide. However, Lin Feng must take the initiative to control it. Otherwise, involuntary cell division would cause immeasurable consequences. Conscious control over cell division could allow the cells to reassemble into the combat body, making the combat body stronger. Lin Feng's combat body had already reached 200,000 kilometers. After using the new substance, his combat body began to expand rapidly. From 210,000 kilometers, 220,000 kilometers, 230,000 kilometers. With almost every breath, Lin Feng's combat body would expand by 10,000 kilometers. This was unimaginable. The combat body could increase by 10,000 kilometers with the span of every breath. Even 10 or 100 star blooms could not do it. However, this was only the initial effect of the new substance. As the new substance was fused, the speed at which Lin Feng's combat body expanded would also increase. In the blink of an eye, Lin Feng's combat body had already reached 300,000 kilometers. It's been 300,000 kilometers. Can elementary planetary life forms attain such a terrifying combat body? Long Wu muttered softly. Back when he was an elementary planetary life form, he was only over 50,000 kilometers in size. Even then, he was still one of the renowned top geniuses. Later, when Long Wu became an advanced planetary life form, it grew by several times, reaching 20 million kilometers. Then, over a long period of time, his combat body slowly grew to 30 million kilometers. He had almost reached his limit and could no longer improve it. His 50,000-kilometer combat body was nothing compared to Lin Feng's 300,000-kilometer combat body. Moreover, Lin Feng's combat body was still improving. As for Raymond and Yu Jing, they were much inferior to Longwu, let alone Lin Feng. Raymond's gaze was profound as he muttered in a low voice, "Could it be that His Highness Lin Feng wants to cultivate the consummate combat body?" Raymond also knew about the consummate combat body, and so did Longwu and Yu Jing. However, this had almost become a legend. Forget about seeing a planetary consummate combat body, they had never even heard of it. It only existed in legends. I don't know if it's a consummate combat body, but His Highness Lin Feng is destined to cultivate the strongest elementary planetary combat body in the history of the Divine Palace of Beaumont. There was a sharp glint in Raymond's eyes. In the past, he only knew a little about Lin Feng. But now, as Lin Feng gradually revealed his secrets, Raymond was extremely shocked. Lin Feng was like an enigma. He was full of secrets. Every secret was earth-shattering and astonishing. At this moment, Lin Feng was immersed in the comfortable feeling of his cells constantly dividing and his combat body constantly expanding. Although cell division was a little painful, especially since it happened so quickly, it was nothing compared to Lin Feng's current will. He even had a feeling of life sublimation. As his cells continued to divide, his combat body continued to improve, and a large amount of energy filled his body. He was filled with vitality. At this moment, Lin Feng suddenly had a feeling that he could touch the gate. The gate to advanced planetary lifeforms. The gate to life transition. It felt like as soon as he exerted himself, he could undergo a life transition and transform into an advanced planetary lifeform. This feeling was very unusual and came up completely naturally. I can undergo life transition now? Lin Feng was a little tempted, even very tempted. No one could be unmoved when facing a life transition. That was a life transition. Once Lin Feng underwent a life transition with a combat body of 300,000 kilometers and became a venerable, he would definitely be the strongest venerable. With the enhancement of the advanced planetary laws, it would be a thousandfold enhancement. Lin Feng would be able to become one of the strongest quasi-emperors in one leap, second only to the Grand Emperors. Who could resist such a temptation? Life transition. Lin Feng closed his eyes. He was also in a dilemma, as if he was engaged in a battle between deities. All kinds of thoughts appeared in his mind. Transition. Metamorphosis. Transition. All he had to do was to agree a little to it, and with a little conviction, he could easily metamorphose into a venerable. Such an opportunity could only be chanced upon by luck. If he missed this opportunity, there was no knowing how long he must wait for the next one. Perhaps if he missed this opportunity, he would never get another. Swoosh! Lin Feng opened his eyes abruptly, and his gaze became incomparably determined. At this moment, he had already made his decision. Suppress. Lin Feng's mind was in a great dilemma. All kinds of thoughts collided, but in the end, he still resisted the temptation. He strengthened his conviction and did not undergo a life transition. Of course, it was just that he was not going to undergo metamorphosis for the time being. Perhaps this was an excellent opportunity. Any other cultivator would probably not give up on this opportunity. However, Lin Feng gave up on it. A life transition with a combat body of 300,000 kilometers might seem already very good. But Lin Feng had not forgotten that he wanted to undergo metamorphosis with a consummate combat body. It was not just because undergoing metamorphosis with a consummate combat body would increase his strength greatly. More importantly, Lin Feng wanted to go further on the path of cultivation. He did not just want to become a grand emperor. He still wanted to become a divine king, a divine venerable, a divine emperor, and even transcend the universe to become a universal life form. If he wanted to go further on the path of cultivation, although a consummate combat body was not mandatory, every step of cultivation was building a foundation. The stronger the foundation, the more stable his future cultivation would be, and the further he could go. Was it worth giving up an excellent opportunity of metamorphosis for an abstract future? Perhaps many people would think that it was not worth it, but Lin Feng felt that it was very worth it. He was still very young. His path of cultivation had always been very smooth. Now that there was a new substance that could help Lin Feng get closer to the consummate combat body, what was there for him to be dissatisfied about? There was still a lot of time in the future. He believed that he would definitely be able to improve his combat body bit by bit, and finally master the consummate combat body. As Lin Feng strengthened his conviction, his combat body expanded again. From 310,000 kilometers, 330,000 kilometers, 350,000 kilometers. Although Lin Feng's combat body was constantly expanding, and the speed of expansion was very fast, this was not metamorphosis. The moment Lin Feng gave up on metamorphosis, he had already lost this opportunity. Although he had lost the opportunity to undergo metamorphosis, Lin Feng's combat body was constantly metamorphosing under the enhancement of the new substance. From 380,000 kilometers, 400,000 kilometers, 450,000 kilometers, 500,000 kilometers, 600,000 kilometers, Lin Feng's combat body expanded faster and faster. In the blink of an eye, it had even expanded to 600,000 kilometers. It was already 3 times larger than Lin Feng's previous combat body. He had a combat body of 600,000 kilometers, and as only an elementary planetary life form. Who had ever seen such a thing? Beside him, Longwu, Raymond, and Yujing were all guarding Lin Feng. However, when they saw the speed at which Lin Feng's combat body was increasing, they were all dumbfounded. Is the effect of the new substance really that good? Yujing could not help but feel a little excited. The combat body had grown by 3-fold at once, and it seemed like it was still growing. She was not hoping to increase the combat body by 3-fold. She would be happy with 30%. Raymond said with a complicated expression, "I'm afraid it's not just because of the new substance. If I'm not wrong, His Highness Lin Feng had probably metamorphosed into a planetary life form with a consummate combat body." What? Metamorphosing into a planetary life form with a consummate combat body. Yujing was dumbfounded. Even Long Wu gasped. They all knew that Raymond was knowledgeable and had always trusted Raymond. But now, the two of them could not quite believe it. "Raymond, are you mistaken? A consummate combat body is almost a legend. How can His Highness Lin Feng possibly transform into a planetary life form with a consummate combat body?" Long Wu did not quite believe it either. Although they had heard of the consummate combat body, it was only a legend. None of them had ever seen it. As for the divine palace of Bamond, no one had ever cultivated the consummate combat body. Long Wu could believe that Lin Feng was indeed very strong, and his comprehension of laws was simply unique and incredible. However, Long Wu would be the first to disbelieve that Lin Feng had cultivated the consummate combat body. Raymond took a deep breath and said slowly, "The consummate combat body is not a legend. At least, there's one person in our divine palace of Bamond who has cultivated the consummate combat body. There's a disciple who has cultivated the consummate combat body in our divine palace of Bamond? Impossible. If there is, it's impossible that I don't know about them." Long Wu absolutely did not believe it. He had been in the divine palace of Bamond for even longer than Raymond. He had never heard of any disciple cultivating the consummate combat body. However, Raymond said slowly, "Who said that it's a disciple? If they're not a disciple, then..." His Majesty the Divine King transformed into a planetary life form with a consummate combat body back then. What? His Majesty the Divine King? Long Wu and Yujing looked at each other. In their eyes, the great and powerful Divine King Bamond was as profound as the vast cosmos. Even the core disciples of the upper district of the Divine Palace knew very little about Divine King Bamond. That's right. His Majesty the Divine King is a cultivator with a consummate combat body. Unfortunately, His Majesty the Divine King failed to master the consummate combat body when he was a planetary life form. His Majesty must have valued His Highness Lin Feng highly, and His Majesty the Divine King might even have placed a trace of hope on His Highness Lin Feng. Raymond had learned these secrets from an unknown source, but neither Long Wu nor Yujing suspected anything. They had known Raymond for a long time, not for a year or two, or for a decade or a century, but for more than 1,000 years. In the past, I could not be not sure if His Highness Lin Feng had metamorphosed into a planetary life form with a consummate combat body. But this time, when His Highness Lin Feng used the new substance, he could improve his combat body by so much. That must be something that can only be done with an incomparably stable foundation. I wonder if His Highness Lin Feng can create a miracle and eventually master a planetary consummate combat body. If that's the case, an invincible Grand Emperor will probably be born in the divine palace of Bamond in the future. He even has a chance of becoming the second divine king in the divine palace. Raymond's gaze was fervent as he stared intently at the figure in the cosmos. The more he learned about Lin Feng, the more Raymond felt lucky that he had invited Lin Feng to form a team back then, and had a good relationship with Lin Feng so far. With this relationship alone, there was no knowing how much benefits Raymond, Long Wu, and Yu Jing could obtain. At this moment, Lin Feng was focused on observing the combat body. He did not know that Raymond had almost figured out his background. However, even if he knew, it was nothing much. At most, he would just smile knowingly. This was because by forming a team with Raymond and the others, and being in the midst of the dangerous tides of the Big Bang, all kinds of methods and secrets would be exposed sooner or later. It did not matter if they were exposed. As long as one was powerful, no one would dare to harbor any ill intentions towards them. Lin Feng had long seen through all this. Hence, he was even more eager to master the consummate combat body. Even if he could not attain the consummate combat body now, he had to try his best to approach it. Hence, he devoted all of his energy to fusing the new substance in a frenzy, propelling the expansion of his combat body. As Lin Feng's combat body continued to expand, Lin Feng finally sensed a trace of consummation. It was 780,000 kilometers. Lin Feng's combat body finally stopped at this figure. It was incredible that a combat body of 780,000 kilometers could appear on a cultivator who was only an elementary planetary life form. The incredible combat body made every move seem to carry great power. Lin Feng clenched his hands. He had never felt such power. This was his combat body. Moreover, more importantly, Lin Feng had sensed the sign of consummation. That's right, consummation. He could sense that if he improved by just a little more and reach 800,000 or 900,000 kilometers in size, he might be able to cultivate a planetary consummate combat body. This was a feat that even Divine King Bamond had failed to accomplish. Previously, Lin Feng had strengthened his conviction and given up on life transitions, and did not advance to a venerable in time. But now it seemed like his choice was correct. He could already see the path to consummation. He was just a little away from cultivating the consummate combat body. Now he only had one thing left to do, and that was to sweep for new substances in a frenzy. He had to find similar new substances again, and master the consummate combat body. Lin Feng could clearly sense that he was just a bit away from attaining the consummate combat body. It was almost within reach. At this moment, no matter who stood in his way, Lin Feng would shove them aside and crush them all. Swoosh! Raymond, Yu Jing, and Long Wu saw that Lin Feng's combat body had already stopped expanding. The fusion should have ended, so they all flew over. Your Highness Lin Feng, how do you feel? Lin Feng sensed his body. There was nothing wrong with it at all. It was even filled with power. I've never felt better. Hurry up and use the new substance. The more we increase our strength, the better we'll be able to survive. Next, we have to do our best to prepare for the second wave of the Big Bang. It may be much more dangerous to sweep for new substances in the second wave of the Big Bang than now. We understand. We'll have to trouble Your Highness Lin Feng next. Raymond and the other two nodded, their expressions rather complicated. Of course they understood what Lin Feng meant. From the looks of it, Lin Feng's combat body should be about to reach consummation. That was why he was so eager to sweep for more new substances. This way they might encounter danger. After all, they would encounter some top-notch venerables or quasi-emperors. It was not impossible for them to even encounter a grand emperor. The more strength they had, the more assurance they would have. Lin Feng guarded Raymond and the other two, and the three of them began to fuse the new substances. Yu Jing and Raymond both only had combat bodies of a few million kilometers. Although they were close to 10 million kilometers, they were still a little short. At this moment, with the help of the new substance, Yu Jing and Raymond both advanced by leaps and bounds. Their combat bodies expanded rapidly, and they had already exceeded the 10 million kilometer mark. Lin Feng was most concerned about Long Wu. Long Wu used the new substance with the best effect among the three of them. Long Wu's foundation was very good. His combat body was a total of 30 million kilometers in size. Even Raymond and Yu Jing combined were not Long Wu's match. With such a powerful combat body and the fusion of new substances, Long Wu's combat body also expanded rapidly. From 30 million kilometers, 35 million kilometers, 40 million kilometers, Yu Jing and Raymond's combat bodies had basically only increased by about 30%. They had just broken through the 10 million kilometer mark and could be considered outstanding among venerables. Of course, they were far inferior to Long Wu's. Long Wu's combat body could be considered the top among venerables. Even a combat body of 30 million kilometers was top-notch in any galaxy. Now, after Long Wu fused with the new substance, his combat body had increased steeply by 50%, instantly reaching 45 million kilometers. Among venerables, apart from Lin Feng, who had cultivated the consummate combat body, and some others, it was almost impossible for anyone to surpass this. The strongest venerable Lin Feng had ever encountered only had a combat body of 40 million kilometers. In terms of the combat body alone, a combat body of 45 million kilometers practically signified the strongest venerable Lin Feng had ever encountered. Great, Your Highness Long Wu. Apart from those quasi-emperors who have comprehended laws, you are already the top venerable. Lin Feng was also happy for Long Wu. At such a critical moment, the stronger Long Wu was, the more advantageous it was for Lin Feng and the entire team. Haha! This is all thanks to the new substance that His Highness Lin Feng had salvaged. Long Wu laughed heartily. What were opportunities? This was an opportunity. If he cultivated step by step, it would probably be impossible for him to increase his combat body to 45 million kilometers in this lifetime. As for why Long Wu, Raymond, and Yu Jing took the risk to fight for new substances in the wave of the Big Bang, it was because of such opportunities. Once they encountered an opportunity and obtained a new substance, even if they could not undergo metamorphosis, their strength would increase substantially. This was especially the case with Lin Feng, the quasi-emperor, leading the way. If they obtained a large amount of new substances, Long Wu might even have a slight chance of becoming a Grand Emperor. Becoming a Grand Emperor was practically the lifelong goal of many venerables. Being able to become a Grand Emperor already meant fulfilling their wish. Long Wu's goal was also to become a Grand Emperor, but without opportunities, it was impossible for him to become a Grand Emperor. Only during the Big Bang, where there were all kinds of miraculous new substances, was there hope for everything. Everyone has already improved greatly. Let's do some planning next. Lin Feng's gaze landed on Raymond. It had to be said that Raymond was indeed the strongest in terms of planning and organizing. Lin Feng was very assured with Raymond in charge of planning. Raymond nodded slightly as well, then said with a smile, "We've gained a lot this time. Everyone has benefited. I have a few plans for what to do next, but before that, I need to ask everyone about their goals. Your Highness Lin Feng, what is your goal? To obtain new substances, make a fortune, and increase your strength? Or do you want to undergo metamorphosis?" He was asking Lin Feng directly. Everyone's gaze fell on Lin Feng. They knew that Lin Feng's goal actually determined their future plans. Lin Feng took a deep breath and said firmly without any hesitation, "I need to do my best to continue to increase the strength of my combat body. The stronger, the better. For this, I can even take risks." Raymond pondered for a moment. He already knew Lin Feng's decision. If your Highness wants to strengthen your combat body, you must obtain precious new substances. However, new substances like the ones we obtained previously are probably very rare. Even if they appear, there is a high possibility of competition. Your Highness Lin Feng, I would like to ask a very important question. I hope Your Highness can answer truthfully. Ask away. Your Highness, Are you confident in dealing with Grand Emperors? Grand Emperors? Lin Feng pondered for a moment and said, I'm not a match for a Grand Emperor, but if I use my trump card, I can hold off a Grand Emperor for a while. Good. That makes things easier. Raymond's eyes were bright, and his voice was filled with excitement. Our plan next is very simple, and that is to sweep. We'll sweep through all the new substances we can discover in a frenzy. There's no need for us to fear anyone below the level of a Grand Emperor. We'll obtain as many new substances as possible so that His Highness Lin Feng can undergo metamorphosis. At the mention of sweeping, Long Wu and Yu Jing both became excited, and the expressions on their faces were slightly complicated. In the past, only Grand Emperors could sweep through an area during the Big Bang. Unexpectedly, they actually had the ambition and capability to begin sweeping now. Of course, the main force of the sweep would definitely be Lin Feng. No problem. We'll sweep through all the new substances. Not a single one will be spared. A sharp glint also appeared in Lin Feng's eyes. It concerned the consummate combat body he was about to master. He was willing to pay any price. Boom! The second wave of the Big Bang had finally begun. It was as if a huge tide appeared in the vast and cold universe, surging over, sweeping through the cosmos, and destroying everything. Some cultivators who had just arrived stared at the terrifying Big Bang in shock. Even though they had long heard that the Big Bang was very terrifying, without seeing it with their own eyes, who would believe in the terror of the Big Bang? But now, the Big Bang was right in front of everyone. After witnessing the Big Bang, no one had any wishful thinking anymore. If they met the Big Bang head-on, even if it was not the core region, even a Grand Emperor would probably die. Is this the Big Bang? It's truly frightening. The Big Bang represents both danger and opportunity. I wonder if any Grand Emperors will fall in this Big Bang? Many cultivators sighed. Grand Emperors were already the strongest beings they could see among cultivators. After all, divine kings were almost always the hegemon of a galaxy. They definitely would not make an appearance easily. The strongest being an ordinary cultivator could come into contact with was a Grand Emperor. A Grand Emperor dominated the cosmos. If a Grand Emperor fell, it would definitely be a major event in the universe. As the second wave of the Big Bang erupted, countless cultivators were tempted. Everyone knew that as the Big Bang broke out, many new substances would be sprayed out. This was the chance for cultivators. The first wave of the Big Bang was still relatively small in range, with a radius of almost 1 light-year. The second wave was much larger, and almost enveloped the range of 5 light-years. 5 light-years was a considerable distance. It was even enough to accommodate an intense battle between a few Grand Emperors. It had to be known that a battlefield for Grand Emperors was not so easy to find. Ordinarily, during a battle between Grand Emperors, there was no knowing how many planets would be destroyed. In fact, if they fought without restraint, it would destroy half a galaxy. However, those Grand Emperors still seemed indifferent to the second wave of the Big Bang. Those ordinary planetary lifeforms and many venerables were already tempted, but the Grand Emperors were very calm. Up until now, not a single Grand Emperor had entered the area of the explosion. The reason was actually very simple. The Grand Emperors or Divine Kings were not interested in this little amount of new substances. Each wave of the Big Bang became more violent than the previous. The more violent the explosion, the more new substances it would spew out, and the more precious it would be. The Grand Emperors or the Divine Kings were still waiting for even more violent explosions. The Grand Emperors were indifferent, as if they looked down on the new substances that exploded during the second wave. However, to those ordinary planetary lifeforms and venerables, such new substances were irresistibly tempting. The number of cultivators in the second wave of the Big Bang was almost several times that of the first wave. The competition was destined to become even more intense. Top venerables and quasi-emperors would act one after another. To those cultivators who wanted to join the action, this 5 light-year region was very likely to be a slaughterhouse. However, wealth moved the heart. Even if it was really a slaughterhouse, many cultivators would still be willing to take the risk. There was no one around in the quiet cosmos. But suddenly, as the wave of the Big Bang swept over, A terrifying tidal force wreaked havoc in the surroundings. A venerable was foraging around. This venerable's combat body was also extremely massive, at least 20 million kilometers in size. Cultivators with combat bodies of more than 20 million kilometers could already be called top-notch venerables. This top-notch venerable's name was Holland, and he was a great dominus in a remote galaxy. Holland had already cultivated for 120 million years, but ever since his combat body reached 20 million kilometers, he had not improved at all for thousands of years. He had lived for too long and was too bored. It was insurmountably difficult to improve his level of cultivation. Finally, Holland learned about the Big Bang. Such an opportunity could only be chanced upon by luck. If he missed it, there was no knowing how long he'd have to wait until the next one. He might not even be able to live until the next one. Hence, Holland made up his mind. He would challenge it one last time. Then, he came to the end of the universe. Although he missed the first wave of the Big Bang, fortunately, he did not miss the second wave. Holland could manage to withstand the mighty tidal storms around him, but he did not have any special methods to find new substances. He could only rely on luck. In reality, most cultivators relied on luck to find new substances. Only cultivators who had comprehended laws could find clues to new substances according to the abnormal fluctuations of some laws. Although Holland was just trying his luck, he was actually really lucky. As soon as he entered the region of 4 light-years, he saw something churning in a tide. A new substance. Holland was overjoyed. Apart from cultivators, only new substances could stir in the tide of the Big Bang. I'm so lucky. The new substance is mine. Holland immediately grabbed at the new substance in the distance with his huge hand. Violent fluctuations spread in all directions at once. The wave boiled at once, like a volcanic eruption, and terrifying fluctuations of power spread in all directions. This is? Holland's expression changed drastically. This was a very precious new substance. It must be very precious. Otherwise, how could it have caused such a huge commotion? Holland was both surprised and overjoyed. It was not easy to encounter a new substance. Of course, he hoped the new substance was as miraculous as possible. However, if other cultivators discovered the commotion caused by the new substance, he would be in danger. Get here! Holland immediately unleashed his full strength. His 20 million kilometer combat body erupted completely. Immediately, it formed a terrifying hand that blotted out everything as it grabbed hard. So heavy! Holland realized that the new substance was very heavy. Moreover, when he held it in his hand, it was like sand. It was very scattered, seemed to be in a pile, and was emitting specks of light. It's very extraordinary. Holland knew that this new substance must be very extraordinary. Although he did not know its use, it must be invaluable as a new substance. He was already extremely lucky to have discovered this new substance. Just as Holland was being overjoyed, 3 massive figures appeared in the distant cosmos. What a great new substance! Aha, we're in luck. Only a venerable got the new substance. These figures all had combat bodies of at least 20 million kilometers. One of them was a top venerable with a 30 million kilometer combat body. As soon as the 4 of them appeared, Holland's heart skipped a beat, and his expression darkened. Go! Almost without any hesitation, Holland put away the new substance immediately, and his massive combat body fled back in a frenzy. Trying to run? Haha, you can't run. Who'd expect to find something so soon after entering the region of the Big Bang? Looks like we're in luck this time. There was a trace of joy in the voice of the man with a combat body of more than 30 million kilometers. Then, the 30 million kilometer combat body erupted at full force. A terrifying pressure enveloped Holland from all directions, and even his aura was locked onto. There was no escape. Holland's expression was very grim. It had been hard to make up his mind and come to the Big Bang to try his luck, only to actually encounter danger. None of these 4 people were inferior to him. Moreover, they had locked onto his aura. It was impossible for him to even escape. I'll give you the new substance. Holland gritted his teeth. No matter how reluctant he was, he knew that if he insisted on holding on to it, he probably wouldn't be far from death. Staying alive was the most important thing. Only by staying alive could there be hope. For a moment, Holland even regretted coming here. But at this moment, he had no choice but to throw over the new substance. "You're a sensible one." The new substance was thrown at the four of them, but a hand suddenly stretched out in midair and grabbed it. The expressions of the four of them froze, and their gazes turned cold. "Who dares to intercept us?" The four of them were simply furious. This was an interception. It was simply snatching new substances from their hands. The four of them were used to doing whatever they wished in the cosmos, and had never encountered such a situation. The owner of that huge hand was a woman. However, her combat body was even larger, close to 40 million kilometers. The combat body of 40 million kilometers made the expressions of the four cultivators change slightly. However, they had the advantage in numbers and were not too far off. Hence, the four of them immediately surrounded the woman. "You're courting death." The woman's voice was cold. In an instant, her massive combat body seemed to have transformed into a huge meteor that crashed down, crushing everything. That terrifying power was simply shocking. No. Two of the four cultivators with combat bodies of 20 million kilometers were actually crushed in an instant. An origin weapon. The remaining two were incomparably shocked and furious. An origin weapon. It was actually an origin weapon. Not only did the woman have a combat body of 40 million kilometers, she also had a powerful origin weapon. With this origin weapon, forget about just the four of them, even 14 of them would die. "Run! Run now!" The two of them quickly fled. How could they dare to fight for the new substance? Seeing the two of them flee, the surrounding cultivators who had already noticed this commotion fell silent. As for Holland, who was the first to obtain the new substance, he was even more shocked. He had already fled incredibly far. Two venerables and top-notch venerables with combat bodies of more than 20 million kilometers at that, were easily crushed into dust and turned into a part of the cosmos. Under normal circumstances, the fall of a top-notch venerable would definitely be a major event in any galaxy. However, during the Big Bang, forget about a venerable, even a Grand Emperor might fall. During the first wave of the Big Bang, it might not have been so bloody. But now, as many cultivators entered the region of the Big Bang, as more and more new substances appeared, competition and killing were inevitable. That must be Venerable Lung Ro. That's right, it's Lung Ro. She's one of the 81 disciples of Grand Emperor Glacial, and the favorite disciple of Grand Emperor Glacial. She already has a combat body of 40 million kilometers now, and is very likely to become a Grand Emperor in the future. This is a true top-notch venerable with terrifying strength. Ordinary venerables can't compare at all. As more and more cultivators appeared, there came to be cultivators from various galaxies. Naturally, some people recognized Lung Ro. Not one of the venerables with 40 million kilometer combat bodies was a nobody. Lung Ro glanced around. She did not dare to linger and prepared to leave. However, just as she was about to leave, four more figures suddenly appeared. Disciples of the Divine Palace of Bamond clearing the site. "Hand over the new substance, and you may live." A cold voice suddenly sounded. Even though sound could not be transmitted in a vacuum, this cold voice still entered the ears of all the surrounding cultivators. All the cultivators were slightly stunned. They had a surreal feeling. Who would dare to be so arrogant? Even a Grand Emperor wouldn't be so arrogant, right? They were directly clearing the site. Divine Palace of Bamond? Never heard of it. How strong is it? The Divine Palace of Bamond is a hegemonic faction in the Bamond galaxy. The Divine Palace has a divine king, and not many cultivators dare to provoke it. What? A divine king-level faction? A divine king-level faction has already intervened. As the Big Bang continues to spread, more and more new substances will appear, and more powerful factions will appear. The Divine Palace of Bamond is indeed very strong. There are even a few Grand Emperors. Such an arrogant tone and forceful attitude. Could it be a Grand Emperor from the Divine Palace? Hearing such arrogant and forceful words at once, many people erupted. Of course, to those cultivators who were just watching the show, Whether the divine palace of Bamand was strong or weak had nothing to do with them. At most, they would exclaim about how many factions the Big Bang had attracted. However, to Lung Ro it was a huge pressure. She had also heard of the divine palace of Bamand. It was a divine king-level faction, and there were even several grand emperors. However, when the 4 cultivators appeared, many people were slightly stunned. There was no grand emperor. All the grand emperors in the divine palace of Bamand were famous. There was no such thing as concealed grand emperors. It was far too difficult for a grand emperor to conceal himself. Moreover, if someone was really a grand emperor, there was no need to conceal himself either. If a grand emperor appeared, their every move could suppress the cosmos and even laws would be affected. The power of a grand emperor was already well established in the hearts of people. With just a little detection of the aura, one could tell if it was a grand emperor. Without a doubt, there was no grand emperor among these 4 cultivators. Not grand emperors, yet they speak with such arrogance. A cold glint flashed across Lung Ro's eyes. Without even saying a word, her 40-million-kilometer combat body unleashed all its power at once. It instantly locked onto the 4 of them, enveloping them in the attack range of her combat body. Boom! Suddenly, one of them used the combat body, and it expanded to 45 million kilometers at once. Break! The one who used the combat body was naturally Long Wu. Only Lin Feng and the other 3 could say, "Clear the site." They were not very lucky. After searching for so long, even with the help of Lin Feng's laws, they still did not encounter any new substances. After sensing the commotion here, the 4 of them immediately rushed over in excitement. Fortunately, although there had been an intense battle for the new substance, the cultivator who had obtained it had yet to leave. Hence, Lin Feng and the other 3 intercepted Lung Ro. When Long Wu used his 45-million-kilometer combat body, he also intimidated the surrounding cultivators. When she saw Long Wu's 45-million-kilometer combat body, a strange glint flashed through the eyes of Lung Ro, who considered herself a prodigy and had a chance of becoming a grand emperor in the future. Being able to cultivate the combat body to 30 million kilometers was already commendable. Being able to cultivate the combat body to 40 million kilometers was even rarer. A galaxy that could give birth to a venerable with a combat body of 40 million kilometers was already considerably good. Long Wu had actually cultivated his combat body to 45 million kilometers. That was simply unimaginable. He was a genius among geniuses. Even though she was shocked, Lung Ro still had no intention of stopping. Although the combat body was very important, other methods were equally important. Strength was not just about competing in combat bodies. For example, she still had the origin weapon bestowed by her master, Grand Emperor Glacial. That's the Glacial Pearl? Heavens, it's the origin weapon that Grand Emperor Glacial was long famed for. I heard that it's the origin weapon that Grand Emperor Glacial had always used before he became Grand Emperor. Who'd have thought he would bestow it to Lung Ro? He even gave the Glacial Pearl to Lung Ro. Looks like the rumors are true. Grand Emperor Glacial has already regarded Lung Ro as his successor, and wants to nurture her to become the 2nd Grand Emperor. Seeing Lung Ro use the Glacial Pearl, all the surrounding cultivators gasped. The power of the Glacial Pearl was secondary, but its significance was very great. It was practically the symbol of a Grand Emperor. Of course, the power of the Glacial Pearl was also very terrifying. In particular, when combined with Lung Ro's glacial combat body, all the power in the Glacial Pearl could be unleashed. Boom! The 2 massive combat bodies collided fiercely, and it was as if the entire cosmos shook. Even the tidal wave region of the Big Bang was still stirred by traces of ripples that quickly spread in all directions. Crunch! How powerful was the 45-million-kilometer combat body of Long Wu? With the clash, he sent Lung Ro flying. However, Lung Ro's Glacial Pearl was indeed powerful as well. Even the 45-million-kilometer combat body of Long Wu was actually frozen at once. He would not be able to break free in a short period of time. Moreover, this glacial force could seep into the combat body and destroy the cells of the combat body. Even Long Wu's strongest combat body of 45 million kilometers was rendered immobile instantly. Seeing this scene, everyone was very surprised. But at the same time, they felt that it was only natural. Leng Ro had the treasure bestowed by the Grand Emperor Glacial. She was not weak herself, and was almost invincible among venerables. The 45 million kilometer combat body possessed by the disciple of the Divine Palace of Bamand was indeed commendable. But so what? Leng Ro was a disciple nurtured by the Grand Emperor Glacial with his full focus, while there were countless disciples in the Divine Palace of Bamand. Long Wu was only one of the disciples of the Divine Palace. This is interesting. He was just saying that they're gonna clear the site. Why is he frozen now? Clear the site? Do disciples of the Divine Palace thinks that they can sweep through everything just with the name of the Divine Palace alone? What a joke. Haha. How can it be so easy to provoke a disciple of a Grand Emperor? The Divine Palace of Bamand has really lost face this time. These Divine Palace disciples aren't very strong. Yet they talk big. I wonder if they'd still have the face to see other Divine Palace disciples after they return. If a Grand Emperor took such a tone, it wouldn't be a big deal. But if they're not Grand Emperors, how dare they announce that they'll clear the site? The other cultivators did not have such a good impression of the disciples of the Divine Palace of Bamand. This was especially the case when Long Wu had shamelessly announced about clearing the site just now. Of course he had incurred the wrath of the masses. Now that he had been taught a lesson by Leng Ro, it was equivalent to avenging their grudge. Naturally, all of them mocked him. However, they were only mocking him while hiding at the back. No one really dared to step forward and take advantage of Long Wu's weakness to add insult to injury. The reputation of the Divine Palace and a Divine King-level faction could still hold up. Leng Ro took the opportunity during the clash just now to continue retreating. She was very clear-headed. So what if she was the disciple of a Grand Emperor? During the Big Bang, forget about the disciple of a Grand Emperor, even a Grand Emperor might fall. She had already obtained the new substance, and she had defeated a disciple of the Divine Palace of Bamand. So she should retreat immediately and digest the spoils of war. Otherwise, if she angered an expert or even a Grand Emperor, the gains would not make up for the losses. As she saw it, the 4 disciples of the Divine Palace of Bamand in front of her were like idiots. They actually dared to spout nonsense about clearing the site without the power to back it up. It was simply a huge joke. Crunch. Long Wu was frozen. At this moment, he had already opened up a crack. Then, the ice was completely shattered, and Long Wu escaped. However, his expression was very dark. Long Wu, are you all right? Raymond and Yujing hurriedly rushed over. They did not expect that a random competitor for the new substance they had encountered would actually be a disciple of a Grand Emperor. Moreover, she was so strong that even Wulong could not do anything to her. They had a poor start and failed at the beginning. The 3 of them had rather grim expressions. They looked at Lin Feng, who had been very calm the entire time. Your Highness Lin Feng, It's fine. Lin Feng waved his hand, appearing very calm. He looked into the distance, where Leng Ro's massive combat body was rapidly retreating. Since we've already said that we'll clear the site, how can we let it be anticlimactic? Leave the new substance behind. A smile appeared on Lin Feng's lips. Then he extended a hand. This hand expanded rapidly. Lin Feng did not even use his combat body. He only used one hand. In an instant, it was as if the universe was shaking. Boundless tidal power gathered in a frenzy in Lin Feng's palm. Vaguely, with the help of the infinite tidal power in the surroundings, a huge phantom appeared in Lin Feng's large palm. It was formed entirely from tidal power. The huge phantom palm was simply too massive. Covered the cosmos. Even Leng Ro's combat body of 40 million kilometers seemed tiny before Lin Feng's phantom palm. Boom! When Lin Feng struck down with his palm, a trace of panic appeared on Leng Ro's face. For the first time, Leng Ro felt a strong sense of danger, as if her life would be in danger once the palm before her landed. Leng Ro roared and unleashed the full power of her combat body. A combat body of 40 million kilometers was extremely powerful. With the help of a Grand Emperor's origin weapon, the Glacial Pearl, Lung Ro's current strength had truly reached the peak of a venerable. However, all this effort was meaningless before Lin Feng's palm. Lin Feng slammed his palm down. The combat body in Lung Ro's entire body was collapsing, and countless cells were being annihilated. A force so powerful that it was impossible to resist charged into her body. This? Lung Ro was aghast, and a trace of despair appeared on her face. She could not resist. She could not resist at all. With a single strike, her combat body shattered like an eggshell. I'll give you the new substance. Spare my life. Lung Ro could no longer maintain her indifference. In a few breaths, her combat body was already on the verge of collapse. If this continued, she might really die. She could not withstand the power behind a single strike. This could not be anything but a grand emperor. Swoosh! Lin Feng grabbed the new substance and retracted his hand. However, half of Lung Ro's combat body had already been destroyed. Only 20 million kilometers were left of the once 40 million kilometer combat body. If she delayed any longer, it would probably really be too late. Seeing how Lung Ro fled in desperation and Lin Feng easily obtained the new substance, the surrounding cultivators who were watching the commotion were all dumbfounded, as if they could not believe the scene before their eyes. Only just now, they were mocking the divine palace of Bamond for being ignorant and talking big. Lung Ro alone could render them unable to do anything. But now, they could only open their mouths, not knowing what to say. A grand emperor? It's not a grand emperor. If I'm not wrong, that's a quasi-emperor. What? A quasi-emperor? I never thought there would be a quasi-emperor, and a very terrifying one at that. He's probably one of the best among the quasi-emperors, and only half a step away from becoming a grand emperor. Although a quasi-emperor was not a grand emperor, they could defeat all venerables. Moreover, quasi-emperors had basically all comprehended laws. Their combat power was only inferior to a grand emperor. At this moment, no one would think that the disciples of the divine palace of Bamond were joking about clearing the site. Disciples of the divine palace of Bamond clearing the site. If any more cultivators linger within 10 billion kilometers, they will be killed without mercy. Lin Feng's words were even more arrogant and domineering, spreading in all directions. As soon as Lin Feng finished speaking, the expressions of the surrounding cultivators who were watching the commotion changed drastically. Many cultivators left one after another. Although those cultivators who had their own motives or some confidence in their strength had indignant expressions, they could only leave. Clearing the site. This was clearing the site in its true sense. If the first time Long Wu cleared the site as a disciple of the divine palace of Bamond might be a joke, and no one would leave, no one could remain unmoved when Lin Feng said that he would clear the site now. After all, if a grand emperor did not appear, a quasi-emperor was practically invincible. Lin Feng was qualified to clear the site. Long Wu heaved a long sigh and said with a wan smile, "I'm really ashamed. I almost screwed up. Fortunately, Your Highness Lin Feng intervened. Otherwise, we would probably all be jokes." Long Wu was rather bummed. He was indeed very strong, but he had encountered Lung Ro, the disciple of a grand emperor. It seemed like a coincidence, but it was actually inevitable. Even if he had not encountered Lung Ro this time, he would encounter someone else the next time. This was because Long Wu did not have the power to clear the site. If he insisted on clearing the site, something like this would happen. Lin Feng, on the other hand, paid no heed to it. He said calmly, "Your Highness Long Wu is already very strong. Although there were some twists and turns in the process, we still achieved our goal. We've obtained the new substance and cleared the site. The next step is to sweep through." Sweeping through the cosmos and all new substances was Lin Feng's goal. By the way, this new substance should be some kind of material, and cannot help the cultivation of the combat body. Lin Feng looked at the new substance in his hand. Although it could not help with the cultivation of the combat body, even as a material it would be very precious and unique. In the future, he could use this new material to exchange for some precious miraculous items. There was no such thing as useless new substances. Every new substance had its own unique effect. If Lin Feng could really acquire many new substances from sweeping, even if there were no new substances that could be used to cultivate the combat body, they would still be enough to exchange for a large amount of miraculous items in the universe. By using them to cultivate the combat body, he would still have a chance to master the consummate combat body. Hence, any new substance was very precious. Lin Feng and the other three took action again, and their actions were fast and impactful. After clearing the site, even their luck seemed to have improved, and they obtained 3 new substances in succession. Unfortunately, not one of the new substances could be used to cultivate the combat body directly. However, there was still a lot of time. Lin Feng was not in a hurry, and only continued to expand the range. However, as Lin Feng and the other 3 expanded their range, they eventually encountered other cultivators. Some encountered Lin Feng by accident and wanted to try their luck. Some were just trying their luck, feeling that it was impossible to encounter Lin Feng and the other 3 in such a large range. However, these people were unlucky. Lin Feng did not let these people off again. Be it venerables or elementary planetary lifeforms, as long as they were within 10 billion kilometers of him, Lin Feng would kill them directly. Previously, when Lin Feng defeated Leng Ro, some cultivators still could not see the truth. However, as Lin Feng attacked repeatedly, there were a few times when he went all out and did not hold back at all. After a few top-notch venerables died, all the cultivators became obedient. They absolutely did not dare to enter Lin Feng's 10 billion kilometer radius again, because that was Lin Feng's clearing range. They would never provoke Lin Feng again. With a combat body of 780,000 kilometers and a 1,000-fold enhancement from advanced law, Lin Feng's combat body would be equivalent to 780 million kilometers. He was one of the best even among quasi-emperors. With such strength, he could sweep through the entire cosmos. No one below the level of Grand Emperors was his match. Lin Feng carried out the sweeping. He was really sweeping, and there were a lot of gains. However, Lin Feng's domineering behavior had already incurred the displeasure of most cultivators. There were even some quasi-emperors among them. In the vast cosmos, Venerable Starfall arrived at the end of the universe in a flowing white robe. I finally reached here in time for the second wave of the Big Bang. Venerable Starfall's gaze was profound. It had been a long time since he had roamed around the outside world, because it was very rare for anything in the outside world to interest him. To Venerable Starfall, becoming a Grand Emperor was the only goal he pursued. Apart from that, nothing was comparable to the most important thing to him. The Big Bang could spray out all kinds of miraculous new substances. Perhaps some kind of new substance could improve his strength further, and even allow him to become a Grand Emperor. He had waited too long for this day. It was just that he was too far away, and he was caught up in other affairs. He had only arrived at the end of the universe now. Fortunately, there was still time. The second and even third waves of the Big Bang were still competitions between elementary and advanced planetary lifeforms. By the fourth and fifth waves, it would become a competition between the Grand Emperors. Even Venerable Starfall, a dignified quasi-emperor, absolutely did not dare to participate in the game of the Grand Emperors. Hence, this was the last chance for Venerable Starfall. In reality, top-notch venerables or quasi-emperors like Venerable Starfall had already entered the tide of the Big Bang. Occasionally, some people would hear that someone had cleared the site, but they would ignore it. If it wasn't a Grand Emperor, they would not care at all. The 11th new substance. Lin Feng obtained another new substance. It was still not something for cultivating the body. He was a little disappointed. After searching for so long, he still could not find a new substance to cultivate the combat body. Actually, this was the normal case. There were many new substances, but very few new substances that could improve the cultivation of the combat body. Those were very precious. Lin Feng had gotten lucky. There was no knowing how many experts would go crazy over the new substance they obtained previously. During the second wave of the Big Bang, Lin Feng and the other 3 were clearly not so lucky. Things had returned to their normal state. Boom! Suddenly, it seemed as if the cosmos itself was shaking. In the tide, any cultivator who had comprehended laws or those in the vicinity would feel this violent vibration. Basically, more than half of the cultivators sensed it. After all, the tremors were too intense. The tides kept rolling, like ripples spreading in all directions. Such tremors! Lin Feng was shocked. These tremors were too strong. They were much stronger than the tremors from the new substance he had encountered during the first wave of the Big Bang. It almost shook most of the area within 5 light-years. There must be a new precious substance out there. Lin Feng's heart burned with desire. Whether this new substance was helpful for the cultivation of the combat body or not, it was definitely a very precious new substance. Even the 11 new substances they had obtained up till now added together were probably not as precious as this new substance that was shaking so violently. Let's go. We must obtain this new substance at all costs. Lin Feng lowered his voice, and there was a trace of excitement in his tone. This is a new substance? Venerable Starfall looked at the terrifying fluctuations in the distance. How could he not know that a terrifying new substance might have come into being? Such a new substance could only be chanced upon by luck. It could even allow his combat body to improve greatly and give him a chance of becoming a Grand Emperor. A Grand Emperor was practically the limit that ordinary cultivators could reach. Once one became a Grand Emperor, they would basically stand at the peak of the universe. No matter where they were, they would be a hegemon of a region. Although Venerable Starfall was a quasi-emperor, quasi-emperors only surpassed venerables in terms of combat power. In reality, their realm was still that of a venerable, and their life level was still at that of advanced planetary lifeforms, no different from a venerable. It was also extremely difficult for quasi-emperors to become Grand Emperors. Compared to venerables, the only advantage quasi-emperors had was probably their powerful combat power. By relying on combat power, they could obtain more resources and have a better chance of becoming Grand Emperors. However, this was only the ideal situation. How precious were resources that could allow one to metamorphose into a Grand Emperor? There were little of them even in the entire universe. Only the new substances spewed out during the Big Bang had a trace of possibility of aiding one to become a Grand Emperor. How could Venerable Starfall be willing to miss such an opportunity? I must obtain this new substance. I must. Venerable Starfall's eyes shined with madness. Boom! An incomparably huge behemoth destroyed a dead planet in the cosmos. In the Big Bang, the planets that survived were all incomparably sturdy, but there was definitely no life on them. Even if there were, they would long have been destroyed. Nothing. How can there be no new substances? Betas's face was filled with anger, and even the expression on its face was distorted. It was the king among behemoths, and had long been a famed king of behemoths. It dominated the cosmos and was invincible. However, it was not a Grand Emperor yet. It also wished to become a Grand Emperor. Now, becoming a Grand Emperor was its sole pursuit. However, since coming to the Big Bang, Betas had not gained anything at all. Huh? This fluctuation, is it a new substance? Suddenly, the aura on Betas's body gradually calmed down. It sensed a terrifying fluctuation that spread in all directions, almost shaking most of the cosmos within a radius of 5 light-years. Something that could evoke such terrifying fluctuations must be a very precious new substance. It drove even Betas into a frenzy. I must get it. I'll devour anyone who gets in my way. Betas took on a vicious look. In any case, it had also devoured many cultivators before, including some top-notch venerables. A man in black appeared. His entire body was like a glacial cave, freezing even the cosmos. He reached out and grabbed, and cracks appeared in the cosmos. Crunch. Cracks appeared on the ice. It turned out that the man in black had frozen everything within a radius of millions of kilometers. In particular, the man in black had not even used his combat body. In the center of the ice there was a new substance. The man in black grabbed it with ease. However, this new substance seemed very ordinary, and failed to satisfy the man in black. Suddenly, the man in black looked into the distance. There was a terrifying fluctuation coming from there. A new substance. And it's not just any new substance. The man in black pondered for a moment, before locking onto the source of the fluctuation. Anyone in my way shall die. The man in black remained as apathetic as ever. However, his apathy was accompanied by infinite coldness, which was countless times stronger than Lung Rose. In the endless universe, waves surged. Terrifying fluctuations spread in all directions, attracting the attention of most cultivators. Be they venerables or ordinary planetary lifeforms, they only had one thought at this moment, and that was to rush to the source of the fluctuation as soon as possible. Even if that place might contain danger, hadn't they come to the end of the universe for opportunities? No matter how dangerous it was, as long as the gains were great enough, some would take the risk. When the first cultivator arrived at the source of the fluctuation, he was stunned by the scene before him. That's a flower? This cultivator was only a very ordinary venerable, but as a venerable, his knowledge was naturally extraordinary. Even so, this venerable was still stunned by the scene before him, and his heart was filled with shock. It turned out that a flower had appeared in the cosmos at some point. That's right, it was a flower. Currently, it was still a bud, and the bud had yet to bloom, as if something was still brewing. Accompanied by the appearance of this flower, ripples of terrifying fluctuations spread in all directions. If it were just a flower, it would not have shocked a venerable. However, this flower was actually as huge as a star where it stretched across the cosmos. It was too stunning. The combat body of a venerable was huge. Even an ordinary venerable was comparable to a star, and a star with a diameter of millions of kilometers at that. The flower in the cosmos was huge and comparable to a star, ready to bloom in the cosmos. Moreover, the flower seemed to be rooted in the void, actually absorbing the power of the surrounding tidal storms. Such a huge flower that contained such terrifying power could not be found even among the many miraculous items in the universe. Retrieve! This venerable was overjoyed. Even though the flower was enormous and he could not take all of it at once, he could still approach the flower and take a portion of it. However, as his large hand reached for the flower, before it could approach the flower, countless roots in the void pierced into the palm at once. No, impossible! This venerable was extremely terrified. He felt that his combat body was actually collapsing, as if it had been devoured by the roots of the flower and turned into nutrients for the flower. As a last resort, the venerable could only abandon most of his combat body. 3 million kilometers of the originally 5 million kilometer combat body was abandoned at once, leaving only a combat body of 2 million kilometers. Just what kind of flower is this? The venerable's expression was uncertain, but he did not dare to approach anymore. At this moment, a huge hand descended from the sky. It seemed ready to take the flower directly. Ha ha! The new substance is mine. It was another venerable. However, this venerable had a combat body of 10 million kilometers. His terrifying combat body erupted at full power. A huge hand that could hold up the sky grabbed the flower viciously, trying to uproot it. However, the bud of the flower shook slightly and immediately bloomed. It expanded tenfold at once like a huge mouth and instantly devoured this venerable with a combat body of 10 million kilometers. There was not even a scream. A venerable with a combat body of tens of millions of kilometers was gone. Just like that. It rose like a snake devouring an elephant. However, the flower in the cosmos seemed to be very calm. The flower only looked even more vibrant, and its bud showed faint signs of blooming. What kind of flower is this? It can actually devour cultivators. Terrifying, truly terrifying. It's not just capable of devouring cultivators. It can even devour the tidal power in the tides of the Big Bang. Moreover, it's rooted in the cosmos and vaguely absorbing energy from space itself. This must be no ordinary new substance. It's very likely some kind of demonic creature. Demonic creature? Whether it's a demonic creature or not, can't you feel that just by approaching this flower, the cells in our combat body seem to be cheering? This flower must be very useful for the cultivation of the combat body. It's a pity that I'm not strong enough. Otherwise, I would definitely give it a try. This flower almost shook most of the area within 5 light years. All the cultivators rushed over. A few bold cultivators wanted to act first, but they were all devoured by the huge flower. Even so, this huge flower still attracted an endless stream of cultivators. However, these cultivators would no longer act rashly. Venerables with less than 20 million kilometer combat bodies would be devoured almost instantly. Only top-notch venerables with combat bodies of over 20 million kilometers could barely manage to resist the flower, but it was still completely impossible to retrieve this huge flower. Moreover, it was impossible to even destroy this huge flower and obtain some petals. Once it was attacked, the huge flower would fight back. Hence, the giant flower was very difficult to deal with. Many cultivators did not dare to even take a step forward. However, as more and more cultivators gathered, some of the top venerables had already arrived. Venerables with combat bodies above 40 million kilometers were top venerables. Even among the many cultivators, they were the cream of the crop. What a huge flower! I can feel my cells cheering and trembling in excitement. After devouring this flower, I will definitely be able to advance further, and even have a chance of becoming a Grand Emperor. A top-notch venerable with a combat body of 48 million kilometers appeared. As soon as he appeared, his terrifying combat body towered over the surroundings, causing the hearts of countless cultivators to palpitate. What a terrifying top-notch venerable! Who is it? Everyone was speculating about the identity of this top-notch venerable. A cultivator who could cultivate a 48 million kilometer combat body could not possibly be a nobody. No matter how low-key he was, it was impossible for him to be unknown. When this top venerable with a 48 million kilometer combat body moved his huge combat body and suddenly reached out to grab the giant flower seemed to have sensed the danger immediately. Its roots tore through the air and wrapped directly towards this top venerable. Collapse! The top venerable sneered. His combat body erupted, and those roots instantly broke. They could not cause any damage to this top venerable at all. Ha ha ha! It's mine! This top venerable threw his head back and laughed aloud. His guess was correct. Although the giant flower was also very strong, and might be able to contend with a 20 million kilometer combat body, if one had a combat body of 30 million kilometers, or even 40 million kilometers, the giant flower would be unable to resist it. Moreover, he had a combat body of 48 million kilometers. Just as this top venerable was about to take the giant flower, a loud bellow suddenly sounded in his ear. Eat, eat, eat. The giant flower is mine. I'll devour anyone who dares to take it. Boom! An incomparably terrifying behemoth appeared. It was Betas. Betas was a cosmic behemoth, and it did not take the same path as cultivators. Although it was not a devouring life form, it was very gluttonous. When it encountered cultivators, it also liked to devour them in one gulp. In particular, Beta's body was too massive, comparable to a quasi-emperor. As soon as it appeared, the expression of the top venerable changed drastically. He unleashed his 48 million kilometer combat body at full force and actually fled. A dignified top venerable, a venerable with a 48 million kilometer combat body, actually fled. He did not even dare to touch this huge flower. Betas! It's Betas! The cosmic behemoth! Why is this cosmic behemoth here too? Heavens! It'll devour this giant flower in one gulp. Betas could devour even a venerable in one gulp. 9 top-notch venerables joined forces once, but they were still devoured by Betas in one gulp. It's a behemoth comparable to a quasi-emperor. Seeing that even Betas had arrived, many cultivators shook their heads. There were so many cultivators in this big bang, but in the end, a behemoth was the one to obtain the precious new substance. How ironic! Betas's eyes were fixed on the huge flower. It was almost about to drool. Delicious, incomparably delicious. Just the smell was irresistible to Betas. Although it was not a devouring life form, behemoth life forms actually like to devour as well. This was their nature. How could it not be excited to encounter such a delicious flower that could make its body even larger, and might even allow it to become a grand emperor? Devour! Devour! I must devour it! Betas opened its huge mouth, which was millions of kilometers long. It sucked hard, and devoured the huge flower in the cosmos like a black hole. Even though the giant flower was rooted in the cosmos, it could not resist Betas's devouring at this moment. It began to sway towards Beta's huge mouth, bit by bit. Boom! Before Betas could be happy for long, and before the giant flower was even moved, a huge hand had already slammed into its body, sending it flying for a great distance. Who is it? Who dares to stop me? Beta's was incomparably furious. How could it lose a delicacy that was right at its mouth? Although it also knew very well that anyone who could send it flying with a single palm strike must be a quasi-emperor among cultivators. So what if he was a quasi-emperor? It already had a rough idea of the other party's strength from that palm strike just now. He was about the same as itself, and it might even be slightly stronger. It was only sent flying and wound up in a slightly sorry state because that was a sneak attack. Retrieve. The one who sent Beta's flying was Venerable Starfall. He did not even look at Beta's. Of course he had heard of this quasi-emperor behemoth. He knew that it was impossible to kill Beta's, at least not in a short period of time. Moreover, his goal was this giant flower, not to fight Beta's to the death. Hence, after sending Beta's flying, Venerable Starfall immediately tried to retrieve the giant flower. Bang! However, Beta's was very fast. It had already flown over in the blink of an eye and collided viciously towards Venerable Starfall. The huge combat body of Venerable Starfall was sent flying at once. The infinite tidal power was shattered, and the cosmos seemed to have calmed down all of a sudden. This was a battle between quasi-emperors, and it was a battle between a behemoth and a cultivator who are quasi-emperors. It was a rare occurrence to come by. The surrounding cultivators had long retreated quite a distance. If they did not retreat a little further in a battle between quasi-emperors, so much as brushing against it might severely injure or even kill them. Myriad Starfall. Venerable Starfall went completely berserk. He was a dignified quasi-emperor. When had he ever been in such a sorry state? However, just by relying on his combat body, he was not a match for Beta's. However, as a quasi-emperor, Venerable Starfall naturally had his unique strength. Coupled with his laws, his combat body would be enhanced to a terrifying level instantly. That was the realm of a quasi-emperor. As Venerable Starfall roared, the cosmos seemed to be shaking violently. The nearby planets flew over in a frenzy, and under the control of Venerable Starfall, they gradually condensed into a huge planet. Boom! The giant planet smashed forcefully towards Beta's. Even Beta's felt a trace of pressure. This was Venerable Starfall. Every quasi-emperor lived up to their reputation. This was his state while most of the planets were destroyed by the shockwave of the Big Bang. If this were an ordinary stretch of cosmos, Venerable Starfall could unleash strength beyond his level. He could absorb countless planets, transform them into armaments, and smash them at his opponents in a frenzy. If one planet was not powerful enough, he would amass 10 planets. If 10 were not powerful enough, he would amass 100. If 100 were not enough, he would amass 1,000, 10,000, or even more planets. Before Venerable Starfall, numbers were meaningless. Moreover, the more planets there were, the stronger Venerable Starfall would be. If they were in a specific environment, such as where some superplanets were around, Venerable Starfall could even contend with a Grand Emperor. Every quasi-emperor had infinite possibilities and unique methods. Unfortunately, in the environment of the Big Bang, the methods of Venerable Starfall were weakened to the extreme. Hence, when facing Beta's, he was inferior and constrained at every turn, and was already at a disadvantage. Damn it, Beta's, if you stop me, I'll hunt you down to the end of the universe after we get out. Haha, Venerable Starfall, this is already the end of the universe. Moreover, if I obtain this huge flower, I might even be able to become a Grand Emperor. At that time, it's hard to say who will be doing the hunting. How could Beta's be afraid of Venerable Starfall? Even if Venerable Starfall would be slightly stronger by taking advantage of the environment after they left, his strength was limited, and his advantage was not overwhelming. Since he could not overwhelm it, why would Beta's be afraid of Venerable Starfall? Moreover, with such an opportunity in front of it, even a Grand Emperor or a Divine King would be tempted. If it gave up due to fear, why would Beta's come to the Big Bang at all? Venerable Starfall's face was dark. He gritted his teeth in vexation, but there was nothing he could do. Bang! Venerable Starfall had already been sent flying by Beta's for countless times. Even much of his combat body had collapsed. In such an environment, his power as a quasi-emperor would be greatly reduced. He was not Beta's match. Seeing that Betas had the upper hand and had already repelled Venerable Starfall, a huge hand suddenly extended from the cosmos and enveloped the giant flower. Open! Rumble! The giant flower struggled frantically, as if it had its own consciousness. It knew that it was facing a life-or-death crisis at this moment, and was struggling at all costs. Huh? Who dares? Betas roared in anger, and a terrifying sound wave swept towards the behemoth. However, it was useless against the giant hand. The giant hand even exerted force at once. There was a ripping noise. Finally, the giant flower could not withstand this powerful force and was uprooted. Moreover, it appeared very strange. The roots of the giant flower seemed to be really rooted in the void. After they were uprooted, even space shattered, producing countless spatial fragments. Moreover, a spatial storm swept over majestically. However, neither Venerable Starfall and Betas nor the owner of that mysterious giant hand would care about this minor spatial storm. Betas was incomparably furious. In its opinion, someone was snatching food from the mouth of the beast by snatching the giant flower from its mouth. It was a despicable sneak attack. Leave the new substance behind. Betas roared and spat out a mouthful of flames. This ball of flames was very terrifying. It burned the cosmos and instantly spread onto the huge hand. The huge hand was covered in dense patterns that flickered slightly. It actually resisted Betas's flames. Seeing these patterns, Betas's eyes suddenly focused, as if it had realized something. Dark Venerable, you're the Dark Venerable. Hearing Betas's voice, the jaws of many cultivators around dropped, and they immediately fell silent. The Dark Venerable had comprehended the law of darkness. Although it was only at the rudimentary level, he had already condensed a combat body of 50 million kilometers. How formidable was such aptitude! Hence, with the tenfold enhancement of the law of darkness, he would be a terrifying entity with power comparable to a 500 million kilometer combat body. There was also the mysterious and bizarre abilities of the dark combat body and the law of darkness. The Dark Venerable could definitely be considered a very terrifying and tricky quasi-emperor. Planet Fall. In the depths of the universe, Venerable Starfall's voice actually sounded again. At the same time, a massive planet formed from hundreds of stars gathered by Venerable Starfall smashed towards the giant hand of the Dark Venerable. Venerable Starfall was sent flying by Betas, but he was not discouraged, nor did he give up. Instead, he was preparing his ultimate move, taking advantage of Dark Venerable's sudden appearance to snatch the giant flower, and while Betas was pestering Dark Venerable, Venerable Starfall of Starfalls finally prepared his ultimate move successfully. So what if he's the Dark Venerable? No one can take my opportunity to become a Grand Emperor. Venerable Starfall's eyes were bloodshot, and his expression was filled with madness. For the goal of becoming a Grand Emperor, he did not even fear death. Why would he be afraid of offending the Dark Venerable? Boom! The massive planet formed from hundreds of stars collided with the Dark Venerable's huge hand. Even though the Dark Venerable used all his strength, he still could not withstand the collision. His huge hand was instantly shattered, and the huge flower landed in the cosmos again, captured readily Venerable Starfall. Ha 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 ha! It's mine at last! Venerable Starfall was very excited. He looked at Betas, which was gritting its teeth, and the mysterious and powerful Dark Venerable, and felt incomparably elated. How many years had it been since he had attacked so recklessly? So what if the Dark Venerable was strong? So what if Betas was mad? In the end, the giant flower still fell into his hands. The opportunity to become a Grand Emperor seized by him in the end. Anyone in my way shall die. The Dark Venerable's cold voice resounded through the cosmos. His combat body seemed to be one with the cosmos. For a moment, a cold and fearful aura filled the cosmos. As soon as the Dark Venerable finished speaking, an extremely terrifying aura erupted from the depths of the universe like a storm.